Good morning, everyone. It is an honor and pleasure for me to be here at this extraordinary conference, and I want to express my gratitude to all of the wonderful team here in Colombia that has made such an impact on bringing together all of us to develop new cooperation, to share the information that we have been presenting in lots of really very excellent presentations, and to bring a new development of enthusiasm as we work together for the plants of the Caribbean region. It is certainly very inspiring, and it's something which I know we will go back to our own institutions with new vigor and with new energy and with new determination to achieve all of the things we want to. In my presentation this morning, though, I want to talk about the global strategy for plant conservation. And some of you who heard me talking about it 2 years ago in Eleuthera at the previous Botanical Bridges conference will remember that I talked about the process that was underway at that time to develop a post-2020 global strategy for plant conservation, and indeed what the role of Caribbean botanic gardens could be in it. At that stage, the global strategy for plant conservation was in doubt. We did not know whether the Convention on Biological Diversity would wish to, we thought it would, we hoped it would wish to renew it and refresh the strategy for the coming decades. And I'm really pleased to be able to come to this meeting and stand in front of you and say that in October, the convention agreed that, recommended that a new global strategy for plant conservation should go forward. And we now know the shape that will take. And what is extraordinary and very inspiring is that it has been agreed to by the representatives of 196 countries. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit of background to the GSPC because we all know the words, but sometimes we don't actually know where it comes from, what's behind it. Some of us know it like eating breakfast. We know it's been part of our lives for 20 years or more. But I want to show you why it's important, how it has developed, and what has been its impact. I want to talk a little bit about the development of the post-2020 GSPC, and then what are key actions for botanic gardens, from botanic gardens to support the GSPC and the Global Biodiversity Framework. I also want to explain what is the connection between the GBF and the GSPC, because people do get lost in all of these acronyms and say, well, what's IUCN doing about the GBF in the context of the GSPC? And it can be very confusing. But I want to try to show you some of the linkages and how it can impact on our own work and on the institutions in the Caribbean. Now, going back to the earliest days, the first ideas of having a global strategy for plant conservation came in 1999. And following the International Botanical Congress that year, a declaration, the Gran Canaria Declaration, was developed, which called for a new global focus on plant conservation to ensure that the thousands, tens of thousands of plant species and their habitats that were being lost was a crisis that needed to be addressed. Now, this declaration was then submitted to the Convention on Biological Diversity, so, because that was the natural home to have a strategy for plants as part of the conservation of the biodiversity of the world. And much to everyone's delight, the convention decided to adopt a framework in 2002 on plant conservation, which became the global strategy for plant conservation. It also was remarkable in that it contained, for the very first time, international targets for measurable targets of biodiversity. So the GSPC was a trailblazer to develop measurable targets to call people to account for their actions. It was updated in 2011, also for the period to 2020. And then we reached the period where the convention was going to look forward and say, what happens next? Well, dare I say it, learning from the success of the GSPC, the parties to the convention decided we needed real targets in biodiversity conservation and worked to develop the new global biodiversity framework that has a series of targets for 2030. And I'll say more about that in a moment. And of course, how does the new GSPC relate to that? It's so important. Going back to the previous GSPC, it had 5 objectives: understanding and documenting plant diversity, conserving plants, using plants sustainably, education and awareness, and building capacity to achieve the other goals. And as I said, 16 measurable targets. And while those objectives have now changed and aren't expressed in the same way, that underpins what we all need to do going forward in terms of plant conservation. It had a remarkable impact all around the world in that having a framework to which everyone could relate really did help to mobilize the plant conservation community. Many new institutions said, well, we can make an impact on achieving in our own region, in our own country, in our own city, or in the groups we're most interested in, some of the targets of the GSPC. But it wasn't just at the institutional level that was important. There were major responses from many countries around the world who reported and continue to report on what they're doing in plant conservation at the national levels. And some of the mega diverse countries with huge numbers of plant species in their countries responded with specific strategies and initiatives, including Colombia, which produced the first ever national plant conservation strategy relating to the GSPC, but also Mexico, South Africa, China, Brazil, and so on. And one of the successes of it was that it created a framework of action which was clear and understandable and had these very quantifiable targets. So an individual institution could say, target 8, we can do this. We have these species that would be our contribution to that target, and so on. It also stimulated action and new initiatives at the global level as well. Projects like the development of a World Flora Online, which now includes information up to 1.6 million plant names are now in the World Flora Online. There are species descriptions for several 100,000 plant species from all over the world. And that is directly attributable to having a GSPC, and then many national initiatives too. And it really gave the Botanic Gardens an opportunity to shine and say that we can be central to the achievement of this strategy, to take on a new sense of purpose in some cases, but also a recognition that the international community has come to us and said, can you play a role in helping each country meet the targets of the GSPC? And Botanic Gardens really rose to the occasion and delivered in spades to do that. Of course, not every target was achieved. In fact, most of the targets weren't achieved. And that is, of course, disappointing. But an awful lot more plant conservation was achieved because the GSPC existed than I believe would have happened without it. That is, on the bottom of my slide, you can see some of the sectoral and national responses to the GSPC, but I could have had another 25 or 30 illustrations of documents there if I wanted to. One of the ways that the GSPC was supported was by the creation of the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, which celebrates its 20th anniversary this month. It was launched in 2004 now includes 66 organizations as members. It's a voluntary commitment to supporting implementation of the GSPC. But what's also really crucial is that it provided a means for non-governmental organizations to actually feed into and support the GSPC at the level of the Conference of Parties of the CPD, and to be influential in helping to monitor the achievement of all the strategy and its individual targets, and was highly influential and trusted. And I believe that it's probably the first time that the NGO community was actually formally recognized by the Conference of the Parties, by all of the countries that are part of the CPD, as being the basis for the development of a program like GSPC, and then to helping to lead in implementation and monitor it. And it was something which made the partnership has the great strength to take it forward and to continue to support it, because we are trusted partners of the countries that make up the Biodiversity Convention. But of course, when you get to the end of anything, as Emily described so well on the Global Trees Initiative, you have to start a new process to say what comes next. And we kicked off the idea of a new updated global strategy for plant conservation for after 2020 at a conference that was held in South Africa in 2018. And then after the conference, a smaller meeting was held with representatives of countries and representatives of leading plant conservation organizations to say what should be the options for the next one. And this liaison group requested the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation to come up with a proposal on options for having the next phase of plant conservation integrated into the developing global biodiversity framework that was being considered at that stage by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Following the meeting, the GSPC prepared a set of draft objectives, including some new targets for the next decade. And those were presented to the convention as a paper for its scientific body, Substa, and was there to inform the discussions. Now, one of the things that was interesting was very little reaction to this proposal. And the reaction when we dug deeper was really not a lot of support. Not a lot of support for a new phase of the GSPC, which caused great alarm, particularly me. And I thought, what can we do to make sure that the GSPC is not confined to how can we take it forward so that it is really relevant? We realized that the parties were so busy in developing new biodiversity targets, general biodiversity targets. There wasn't an appetite, there wasn't the energy or the commitment to developing a whole set of new targets just for plants. And so we had to move forward within that context and say, how do we think again about what the shape of the GSPC would be post-2020? And so I was delighted that at the Conference of the Parties 15 invited the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, with the support of the CPD Secretariat, to prepare a set of complementary actions related to plant conservation to support the global biodiversity framework. Now, this was a change, and not having specific targets for plants. We can do that in our garden community quite easily, but not through the convention. And so the GSPC has moved forward with a set of complementary actions. Now, you might ask the question, why complementary actions and not specific GSPC targets? Well, quite truthfully and realistically, one can say that the GBF targets provide the targets for the conservation of all biodiversity. And each one of them, most of them, relates specifically to the plant conservation. And they can be applied well, not only to plants, but also the habitats of plants. And I think there was a risk being expressed by many of the parties to the convention that if there were different targets for plants, they would be confused with the GBF targets, and perhaps they wouldn't be harmonized specifically with those targets. And perhaps, too, they would actually, in some cases, even contradict those targets. And then countries would have to report on a whole set of different targets. And they said, well, with a proliferation of targets and monitoring them in different countries, it would all get out of hand. And so we realized that the complementary actions in plant conservation could be related to each of the specific global biodiversity framework targets and would then provide really the effective indicators for the achievement of those particular targets. And that's the way that it has moved on. Let me say something about the Global Biodiversity Framework too. That was negotiated by the Convention on Biological Diversity and then adopted at COP15 in December 2002. Very tight timetable to achieve its targets by 2030. It has 23 of them, and they're well worth getting to know and understand. And it really is a very ambitious framework that is essentially a strategic plan for conservation of biodiversity worldwide and aims to link to a 2050 shared vision for living in harmony with nature, which biodiversity is at the core of. And that has been adopted by, of course, unanimously, as in all decisions of the Biodiversity Convention, to move forward. Now, I've taken some extracts of Global Biodiversity Framework 2030 targets. Target 2 relates to conserving at least 30% of degraded terrestrial ecosystems and having them under restoration. Absolutely perfect for us in plant conservation. Conservation of 30% of terrestrial inland water, coastal marine areas, especially the ones important for biodiversity, through protected areas, again, would be part of what we would want in a global plant strategy. Conserving genetic diversity, recovery and conservation of species, use of wild species sustainably, monitoring and mitigating the impact of invasive alien species, minimizing the impact of climate change on biodiversity, and also how that relates to carbon sequestration, sustainable management of wild species, and increase in area and access to benefits for biodiversity in urban areas. So really, this is not alien to the plant conservation priorities we have. We can work very well within that framework and relate the complementary actions to each other. It works very well, and it means that the plant conservation we do is directly attributable to the global biodiversity framework. And so how did we move forward? Well, we had to move very rapidly. And in 2023, a whole set of draft complementary actions were prepared and reviewed by the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, by the CDP Secretariat, and then was sent out for peer review to the 196 countries. And many, many comments came back. And it was then presented to the SBSTA meeting in Nairobi in October. And that was some changes were made, that's fine. And these actions were strongly supported by so many countries, saying that it represented a third phase of the global strategy for plant conservation, albeit different from the previous ones, and that the action would support the implementation of the GBF targets. except Target 18, which is about the elimination of harmful substances. But one can argue about directly how we fit into some of the targets. The SBSTA made a recommendation in October that the COP16, which will be in Colombia later this year, in October, I believe, will adopt this voluntary set of complementary actions related to plant conservation. So in effect, the rubber stamp of acceptance will be a decision at the COP here in Colombia to become part of the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Now, one of the things that was really interesting and very exciting for all of us was that part of the recommendation was that it asked the Global Partnership for Plant Conservation, including the members, many of you are members of that partnership, and BGCI provides the secretariat of the partnership. They asked the partnership to provide guidance on using a monitoring framework to implement the voluntary complementary actions and to identify gaps and to develop specific indicators. So our community has been asked by the convention to, or it has been recommended that we will play a role in monitoring the future achievement of the Global Biodiversity Framework, specific to plant conservation. And that is both very, very powerful and a considerable challenge to move that forward. And so the work on what form of the monitoring will take needs to go forward in the coming months to be ensured that at COP16 here in Colombia, this recommendation. Within the complementary actions, there are 16 actions that relate to reducing threats to plants and their habitats. There are 12 actions that relate to meeting people's needs, sustainable use of plants, etc. And then there are 8 actions which relate to tools and solutions, things like information systems and capacity building, training, finance, and so on. And that makes up the total. I think it's 36. There may be changes determined by the COP in October, but essentially we know the shape of the GSPC for the coming decade. It contains all of these specific areas where there are GSPC actions, plant conservation planning, ecological restoration, important areas of plant species and genetic conservation, sustainable harvesting, trade, particularly damaging trade, invasive species, factors threatening plants. All of these are issues we've been talking about in this conference. So it really provides a framework for us. The second half is the use of native plants in climate mitigation and adaptation, so that ecological restoration can become an increasingly important part of carbon sequestration, and that carbon sequestration is not being undertaken purely by planting, for example, eucalyptus and conifers around the world. The focus also of some of the actions relates to plants and development, sustainable management for plant diversity in production lands, plants and their contribution to ecosystem services, and something which is really quite new in our communities to have a focus on green urban infrastructures too. Since the majority of the world's population is going to increasingly live in cities, plant conservation and use has to be a part of cities too. Of course, we mustn't forget that we have obligations to meet the access and benefit sharing regulations of the convention in relation to plant conservation. And that is a target of an action as well. And all of the tools I mentioned that are important to capacity building and public awareness, the building the information systems that will support what we do, help us to make sure we know what our priorities are and how much we are moving forward with achieving what we need to. And also opportunities to bring in other people to contribute through citizen science and conserving, using, and validating traditional knowledge. So it's a much more sophisticated basis for plant conservation than the 16 targets of the previous GSPC. So it gives us a lot more basis to drill down and be sure that we are really tackling the core of plant conservation issues that are required over the coming decade. All of these various strategies are related to each other. The Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the UN General Assembly with its 2030 targets. That will only be achieved in part through some of the targets if the Global Biodiversity Framework is successful. The Global Strategy for Plant Conservation, as I've explained, is essential to the Global Biodiversity Framework. Our own Caribbean region plant conservation strategy with its 2030 targets can fit very nicely into the achievement of the global strategy for plant conservation. And the version that was adopted and finally revised is linked into the program online, so you can take a look at that and its 2030 targets. And there are so many national and institutional responses to this, which will then relate to the GSPC, and ultimately through these various levels of strategies at the global level, contributing to the achievement of sustainable development goals. One of the things I did before coming to the meeting was to look at each one of the complementary actions of the GSPC and each one of the targets of the Caribbean strategy to see how much alignment there was between the two. The Caribbean plan was developed before there were the complementary actions. And I was very relieved and very pleased to see that all of the boxes that are in yellow are ones that have specific, or in some cases, more than one Caribbean target that is directly relevant and applicable to that complementary action. So we're not left with an orphan strategy in the Caribbean. It really can contribute. The ones that are not there are ones that are perhaps not necessarily the top priorities for our institutions to work on. Biosafety, consumption, trade statistics and patterns, sustainable management of production lands, which is a function of agriculture. Some aspects of urban plant diversity hasn't been a top priority in the Caribbean, but we don't need to really worry about that. We can simply see Caribbean plant conservation strategy as our immediate priorities and move forward then also in the context of what individual institutions want to do in relation to other complementary actions. We have a wonderful network of botanic gardens in the Caribbean region, and it's been a real honor for those of us. Your partnership here, we feel honored to be accepted to play roles with you all in the important plant conservation work. And I know, speaking for the Missouri Botanical Garden, that you have a complete and utter guarantee that we will beside you every step of the way in achieving these strategies and actions over the coming years. There are lots of, this is taken from the garden search of BGCI, and it shows that there are lots of institutions, and we know there are lots of barriers to progress, but we know that together we will be able to move forward and really achieve these targets of the Caribbean strategy of the GSPC and ultimately of the biodiversity framework. But we don't have much time, and we need to be very purposeful and very planned and very urgent in what we do. We also need to connect so much with our own national authorities. Every country that is a signatory and has ratified the Biodiversity Convention is obliged to prepare national biodiversity strategies and action plans. every country is now revising those biodiversity strategies and action plans in line with the global biodiversity framework. When I look back at the previous ones on my slide, I see that countries like Belize, Colombia, Cuba, and Mexico get wide mention in their national strategies. And many countries don't refer to botanic gardens or plant conservation at all. So this is really an opportunity for each one of us to engage with our national authorities and say, you are committed to the global biodiversity framework. We can help you in achieving those objectives. Please include us, and we will show you what we can do to support the national plant conservation work as part of your new national biodiversity strategies and action plans. We have been given a remarkable challenge and opportunity by the international community to support and achieve the GSPC actions. And I believe we will really make great strides moving forward over the coming years if we are purposeful, if we are determined, if we have a really good planning process, and if we set our priorities. And I believe that we can collectively, in our networks around the world, and accept an individual responsibility for our institutions and each one of us personally to be resolute and optimistic in support of the national international GSPC action. Because if we are to achieve these targets, we need to do it together. That's the only way to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, Peter. My question is kind of a strange one. So many botanical institutions are responsible for fungal collections. We have fungal, we have the largest fungaria, and even though we know very well plants, we hold that responsibility. Is there any parallel conservation about fungal conservation? Who's taking care of the
Thank you. Great question. There was a lot of debate about whether, for example, fungi and algae would be included within the GSPC. And when efforts were made to expand it, we realized that the state knowledge for many fungal and algal groups and the possibilities of doing conservation were very different from what is in the GSPC generally. And so the advice recommended by the convention was that individual countries could determine if they want, which other groups they wanted to include in their plant conservation actions, but not specifically have those groups called out in the GSPC. The other thing is there have been edits made about plants and fungi, right? It just didn't work because we didn't have the knowledge in many countries to say we need a complete list of the plants and fungi. We're not at that state of knowledge. The other important step is that the fungal community is now starting to look at what it could do and should do in developing specific objectives relating to fungal conservation, and I would hope that the algal community will do the same, but it will be tailor-made for the specifics for those groups as well.
I would like to also comment too. I think Marisi is a very important point in my opinion, because it's a lot of what Peter said is true. So the smaller the organisms get, the less we know them. On the other hand, in terms of biomonitoring, and imagine sort of all the fresh water and increasingly also the water quality convey the same ecosystem functioning. And perhaps sort of the whole framework that you also outlined that gives us a chance to ventilate this. So perhaps, yeah, classical species conservation as we're used to by active populations won't work that easily or not at all, depending. But in terms of giving relevance to what our institutions do it, you know, how this is in other botanic gardens. In our case, we have the large alga group, the group, and I think it's sort of from the people thinking about ecosystem services who are actually very strong in the arguments of the global biodiversity framework, because they say, or well, this is functions, this is important, that has to be priority. Maybe we can move in better to that angle.
uh, Simple question, but thank you for explaining a complex subject. In a room full of people like to identify their names to communicate, are we still allowed to call it GSPC targets?
Simple answer is no. There are not GSPC targets. They're the actions, it's an action framework, and they relate to each one of the actions relates to the GBF, Global Biodiversity Framework targets. So we can, the words we use are fine. We have not replaced the GSPC with complementary action framework. It's still an update to the GSPC, but we have to be cautious about making sure that we don't confuse things by using the old terminology. They are the objectives and goals, but we need to rally around the biodiversity framework targets and achieve those plans in context. GSPC actions. Well, yes, maybe but I think that I think there are already significant efforts being made to develop a series of international garden targets related to the GSPC, and that's fine, because that is our community's targets rather than imposing specific targets on